June 20th, 1944. Saipan Island, Mariana Archipelago. The night air hung thick with humidity as Private First Class Marcus Johnson pressed his back against the rough coral ridge, the weight of his harmonica in his breast pocket a small comfort amid the chaos that surrounded him. 800 American Marines lay scattered across the ridgeline, separated from their main force and surrounded on three sides. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What the trapped Marines believed would be a routine reconnaissance mission would transform into one of the most innovative rescue operations of the Pacific Campaign, revealing how a simple musical instrument and one man's ingenuity could overcome the limitations of wartime communication technology. The date was June 20th, 1944, just 5 days into the American landing on Saipan. The 2nd Marine Division had established a tenuous beachhead, but intelligence about enemy positions in the island's rugged interior remained spotty at best. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Spencer of the 8th Marine Regiment needed better information before pushing inland. "Johnson," Spencer called, motioning to the 22-year-old Marine from Detroit. "Bring that map over here." Private First Class Marcus Johnson hurried over, unfolding the topographical map of Saipan's Central Highlands. Unlike many black servicemen who had been relegated to support roles, Johnson had managed to secure a position as a forward scout, largely due to his exceptional skills in reconnaissance and his uncanny ability to navigate difficult terrain. "Sir," Johnson said, pointing to a ridgeline that ran north to south along the island's spine, "based on what we've seen so far, this elevation would give us the best vantage point of enemy positions to the east." Spencer studied the map, his weathered face betraying nothing of the pressure he felt. Operation Forager, the campaign to take the Mariana Islands, was critical to American strategy in the Pacific. Saipan would put American bombers within range of the Japanese mainland for the first time. "Take Captain Hendricks' company," Spencer decided. "I want eyes on that ridge by nightfall. To observe and report back, no engagement unless absolutely necessary." Johnson nodded, folding the map. As he turned to leave, Spencer added, "And Johnson, take your radio operator. I want hourly updates." "Yes, sir," Johnson replied, though he harbored private concerns about the radio. The SCR-300 was reliable on open terrain, but Saipan's volcanic composition played havoc with radio waves. He'd already witnessed several communication failures since landing. 4 hours later, Johnson found himself moving through dense jungle with Captain Hendricks and 80 Marines from Charlie Company. Sweat soaked through their uniforms as they navigated the treacherous terrain, climbing steadily toward the ridge. Johnson moved at the front of the column alongside Captain Hendricks, occasionally consulting his compass and map. "How much further, Johnson?" Captain Hendricks asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Hendricks was a fair-minded officer from Pennsylvania who had quickly recognized Johnson's talents, disregarding the prejudices that were common at the time. "Less than a mile, sir," Johnson replied, pointing ahead to where the jungle thinned. "The ridge should provide us with a clear view of the eastern approaches." Sergeant Willis, the radio man, trudged up beside them. "Sir, Colonel Spencer is requesting an update." Hendricks nodded. "Tell him we're approaching the objective. Expect to reach the ridge within the hour." Willis adjusted the dials on the radio set, speaking into the handset. After a moment, his expression darkened. "Sir, I'm getting nothing but static. Must be the terrain." "Keep trying," Hendricks ordered. "We'll attempt again when we reach higher ground." Johnson exchanged a concerned glance with the captain. This was exactly what he had worried about. Being out of communication with headquarters was dangerous, especially in unknown territory. As they neared the ridge, Johnson noticed something that sent a chill down his spine despite the tropical heat. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth, different from the standard-issue Marine boots. He raised his hand, signaling the column to halt. "Captain," he whispered, pointing to the tracks, "these aren't ours." Hendricks studied the prints, his expression grave. "How old?" "Hours, not days," Johnson replied. Hendricks signaled for the platoon leaders to gather. "Change of plans. We proceed with extreme caution. Lieutenant Davis, take your platoon and secure the northern approach to the ridge. Lieutenant Rodriguez, you've got the south. We'll establish observation posts along the central portion. As the Marines carefully moved into position, Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The jungle had gone quiet, too quiet. The usual chorus of birds had fallen silent. By dusk, Charlie Company had established a perimeter along 500 yards of the ridgeline. The position offered a commanding view of the valleys below, including several clearings where enemy troops might gather. Sergeant Willis continued his attempts to contact headquarters, but the radio remained stubbornly silent. "Nothing but static, sir," Willis reported to Captain Hendricks. "Something about this ridge is blocking transmission completely." Hendricks frowned. "We're due to report back. Spencer will be wondering what's happening." "We could send a runner back to the lines," Lieutenant Rodriguez suggested. "Too risky in the dark," Hendricks decided. "We'll try again at first light. For now, dig in and maintain strict noise discipline. Johnson, take point on the forward observation post. Your eyes are the best we've got." Johnson nodded and made his way to the eastern edge of the ridge. From this vantage point, he could see all the way to the coast several miles away. The moon was rising, casting a silvery glow over the landscape. In the distance, he could make out the flashes of naval guns as American ships continued their bombardment of Japanese positions. As he settled into position, Johnson reached into his breast pocket and felt the reassuring shape of his harmonica. The small Hona Marine Band harmonica had been a gift from his father before he left for boot camp. "Music has power, son," his father had told him. "It can lift spirits or signal danger. Never underestimate it." Johnson had carried it through training at Montford Point, North Carolina, where the Marine Corps had reluctantly begun accepting black recruits in 1942, and across the Pacific. Throughout the night, Johnson observed the terrain below, occasionally reporting back to Captain Hendricks. There was little movement, although once he spotted what appeared to be a small patrol moving through a clearing 2 miles east. By morning, Sergeant Willis was still unable to establish radio contact. "The battalion will be expecting our report," Hendricks said, concern evident in his voice. "Rodriguez, take 2 men and make your way back to our lines. Inform Colonel Spencer of our position and that we've observed minimal enemy activity thus far." Lieutenant Rodriguez selected 2 Marines and prepared to depart. They had barely disappeared into the jungle when the first shots rang out. "Contact rear!" someone shouted, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Hendricks immediately ordered the company to defensive positions. "Davis, take a squad and see what's happening." Lieutenant Davis and his men rushed toward the sound of fighting, but they returned minutes later with grim news. "Rodriguez and his men encountered an enemy patrol, sir. Heavy exchange of fire. We couldn't reach them." Before Hendricks could respond, more firing erupted, this time from the northern approach to the ridge. "We're being surrounded," Hendricks realized. He turned to Willis. "Radio, now." Willis frantically worked the dials of the SCR 300, desperation evident on his face. "Still nothing but static, sir." Johnson looked toward the eastern valley and felt his blood run cold. In the early morning light, he could see movement, a lot of movement. Hundreds of troops were assembling in the valley below, preparing to ascend the ridge. "Captain," he called. "Eastern approach." Hendricks rushed to Johnson's position and raised his binoculars. "My God," he breathed, "there must be at least 400 of them." Within minutes, Charlie Company was engaged in a desperate defense of the ridgeline. Enemy forces attacked from multiple directions, slowly tightening the noose around the Marine position. Captain Hendricks moved from position to position, directing fire and encouraging his men. "Hold the line," he shouted above the din of combat. "Make every shot count." As the morning wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. The enemy forces were better supplied and more numerous. Charlie Company suffered mounting casualties, and their ammunition began to run dangerously low. By noon, they had been pushed back to a smaller section of the ridge, their perimeter shrinking by the hour. "We need reinforcements," Hendricks said grimly, as he conferred with his remaining officers in a shallow depression near the center of their position. "Without radio contact, we're on our own." "What about flares?" Lieutenant Davis suggested. "Used the last one an hour ago," Hendricks replied. "No response from our lines." Johnson had been listening quietly, his mind racing. An idea began to form, unlikely, perhaps even foolish, but they were running out of options. "Sir," he said, addressing Captain Hendricks. "I might have a way to signal for help." Hendricks looked at him skeptically. "What do you have in mind, Johnson?" Johnson pulled the harmonica from his pocket. "Before I joined the Marines, I worked as a signalman for the Michigan Central Railroad. We used specific whistle patterns to communicate between trains when other methods failed." "A harmonica," Lieutenant Davis scoffed. "How's that going to help us?" "Not directly," Johnson explained, "but during training exercises at Camp Lejeune, I noticed something. When our aircraft conducted strafing runs, they followed specific patterns based on smoke signals or panel markers. What if we could use sound instead?" Captain Hendricks considered this for a moment. "Go on." "The 22nd Marine Air Group is supporting our operations," Johnson continued. "They fly regular patrol patterns over the island. If I can get to that exposed rock formation at the highest point of our position, I might be able to signal any aircraft that pass overhead." "With a harmonica?" Davis remained skeptical. "With a pattern they might recognize," Johnson insisted. "Naval aviators use Morse code too. If I can play a pattern loud enough, SOS followed by our unit designation, there's a chance they might hear it during a low pass." Hendricks looked doubtful, but they were running out of options. "It's a long shot, Johnson." "Yes, sir, it is," Johnson agreed. "But right now, long shots are all we have." After a moment's consideration, Hendricks nodded. "All right, Johnson, it's worth a try. But that rock formation is exposed. You'll be vulnerable up there." "I understand, sir. I'll assign 2 men to provide cover for you." As the afternoon wore on, Charlie Company's situation grew increasingly desperate. The enemy forces continued to probe their perimeter, looking for weaknesses. Ammunition was critically low, and the Marines had resorted to retrieving rounds from their fallen comrades. By 4 o'clock, Johnson was in position at the highest point of the ridge, painfully exposed on the rocky outcropping. The 2 Marines assigned to protect him, Privates Rodriguez and Tanner, crouched nearby, watching for any threat. "I don't hear any aircraft," Rodriguez said, scanning the sky. "They'll come," Johnson replied with more confidence than he felt. "The air group runs regular patrols before dusk." An hour passed with no sign of American aircraft. The sounds of fighting continued below as Captain Hendricks and the remaining Marines defended their ever-shrinking perimeter. Johnson was beginning to lose hope when he heard it, the distant drone of aircraft engines. "Listen," he said, suddenly alert. "Aircraft approaching from the west." Through breaks in the clouds, Johnson caught glimpses of the distinctive silhouettes of Vought F-4U Corsairs, the bent wing fighters of the Marine Corps air groups. They were still high, probably conducting a standard reconnaissance patrol before returning to their carriers. "They're too high," Rodriguez observed. "They'll never hear a harmonica from that altitude." "They might come lower if they spot enemy positions," Johnson replied. "We just need to be ready." As if in answer to his prayers, the formation of Corsairs began to descend, apparently having spotted something of interest in the valleys below. As they dropped to approximately 1,000 feet, Johnson raised the harmonica to his lips. He began to play, not a melody, but a pattern. 3 short notes, 3 long notes, 3 short notes. The universal distress signal, SOS. He repeated it several times, then switched to the Morse code designation for the 8th Marine Regiment. Dash, dash, dot, dot, dash, dot, dot, dash, dash, dash. "They're banking away," Tanner exclaimed in disappointment as the Corsairs completed their pass and began climbing again. "They didn't hear it," Rodriguez concluded. Johnson lowered the harmonica, disappointment washing over him. The Corsairs were indeed climbing back to their patrol altitude, apparently continuing their mission without having noticed anything unusual. But then, remarkably, the lead aircraft suddenly banked sharply, followed by the others. The formation completed a full 180-degree turn and began descending again, this time heading directly toward the ridge. "They heard it," Johnson exclaimed. "Or they saw something." As the Corsairs approached, Johnson played the pattern again, SOS followed by the regimental code. This time, as the lead aircraft passed overhead, the pilot dipped his wings from side to side, an acknowledgement. "They've seen us!" Rodriguez shouted, momentarily forgetting their precarious situation. The Corsairs climbed once more, circled the area, then departed to the west, back toward the American lines. Johnson watched them go, hope swelling in his chest. Would they understand? Would help come? He scrambled down from the rocky outcropping to report to Captain Hendricks. "They acknowledged, sir," Johnson reported. "Dipped their wings in response to the signal. They're heading back toward our lines now." Hendricks nodded, his expression a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Good work, Johnson. Now we wait and see if they understood what you were trying to tell them." As dusk approached, the situation for Charlie Company grew critical. They had been pushed back to a circular perimeter, less than 200 yards across. Of the original 80 Marines, only 58 remained capable of fighting. Captain Hendricks moved among his men, redistributing the dwindling ammunition and encouraging them to hold on. The enemy forces, sensing victory, increased the intensity of their attacks. From his position, Johnson could see that they were massing for what would likely be a final assault, meant to overwhelm the Marines' remaining defenses. "This is it," Rodriguez murmured beside him. "They're coming for us all at once." Johnson checked his rifle. 3 rounds remaining plus 1 grenade. Around him, other Marines were similarly low on ammunition. If the enemy launched a coordinated assault from all sides, they wouldn't be able to hold. The sun had nearly set when Johnson heard it, the distant sound of aircraft engines growing louder by the second. Not just a small patrol this time, but multiple aircraft. "Aircraft approaching!" someone shouted. "Lots of them!" Through the gathering darkness, Johnson could see them, at least a dozen Corsairs screaming in from the west, flying in attack formation. Behind them came the heavier Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Captain Hendricks rushed to Johnson's position. "Your crazy plan worked," he exclaimed, slapping Johnson on the shoulder. The lead Corsairs began their attack runs on enemy positions surrounding the ridge. As they strafed the valleys below, the Marines cheered. The enemy forces, suddenly subjected to devastating air attacks, scattered for cover. "They need to know exactly where we are," Hendricks realized. "Otherwise, they might hit our positions by mistake." Johnson held up his harmonica. "I can signal them." "Do it," Hendricks ordered. Once again, Johnson climbed to the exposed rock formation. As Corsairs screamed overhead, he played his harmonica with everything he had, the SOS signal followed by the regimental code, over and over. In the gathering darkness, he had no way of knowing if the pilots could hear him, but someone did. A Corsair flew directly overhead, so low that Johnson could see the pilot's silhouette in the cockpit. The aircraft wagged its wings, then released a string of flares that burst into brilliant white light, illuminating the Marine position. Within moments, the air attack shifted, precisely targeting enemy concentrations while carefully avoiding the American perimeter. The accuracy was remarkable, as if the aircraft were being guided by an invisible hand. As Johnson made his way back to Captain Hendricks's position, the captain was grinning despite their dire circumstances. "I've never seen anything like it," Hendricks said. "They're hitting targets within 50 yards of our position without endangering us. How are they doing it?" "They're following the sound," Johnson realized, "using my harmonica as a reference point to gauge distance." Throughout the evening, the air attacks continued. Johnson maintained his position, playing his harmonica whenever aircraft approached. The pilots began to recognize the sound, using it to calibrate their attacks with astonishing precision. Enemy forces that had been on the verge of overrunning the Marine position were now in disarray, pounded relentlessly from the air. As midnight approached, Johnson's lips were raw and bleeding from hours of playing the harmonica, but he refused to stop. The survival of 800 Marines, not just Charlie Company, but other units that had been cut off and had joined their perimeter during the day, depended on his signal. The night stretched on, bringing both hope and continued danger. The air support had saved them from being overrun, but the Marines were still cut off from their main force, low on ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Many wounded needed evacuation, and despite the air attacks, enemy forces still surrounded their position. Captain Hendricks approached Johnson during a lull in the fighting. "You've done outstanding work, Johnson," he said, "but we're not out of trouble yet. We need to establish contact with our lines, coordinate a relief effort." Johnson nodded, wiping blood from his lips. "Sir, I've been thinking. If aircraft can follow my signal, maybe ground forces could too." "What do you mean?" The sound of the harmonica carries for miles in these valleys, Johnson explained. If friendly forces are attempting to reach us, they could use the sound to navigate, especially in the dark. Hendricks considered this. It's worth a try, but pace yourself. We may need your signal through the night. Yes, sir, Johnson replied, though he was exhausted and in pain. Around 2 in the morning, Johnson was startled by a hand on his shoulder. It was Sergeant Willis, the radio man. Johnson, Willis said urgently, I've been trying something with the radio. Every time you play that harmonica, I get a brief break in the static. I think the frequency of your playing is somehow temporarily clearing the interference. Johnson looked at him in disbelief. That doesn't make any sense. I know, but it's happening. Play again, just for a minute. Johnson raised the harmonica to his lips and began the SOS pattern. Willis held the radio handset to his ear, his expression intent. There, Willis exclaimed. I heard something. He pressed the transmit button. Any station, this is Charlie Company, 8th Marines. We are surrounded and need immediate assistance. Over. To their astonishment, a faint voice crackled through the static. Charlie Company, this is headquarters, 8th Marines. We read you. What is your position? Over. Willis looked at Johnson with amazement. Keep playing. For the next 10 minutes, Johnson played his harmonica, while Willis maintained tenuous radio contact with headquarters. Through broken transmissions, they managed to communicate their situation and approximate location. Relief force, moving toward your position. ETA dawn. Air support will continue. Mark your position with anything available. Over, came the fragmented response. Willis turned to Johnson with the first genuine smile he'd shown in days. They're coming for us. A relief column is on the way. Johnson lowered the harmonica, his lips too painful to form a smile. Thank God, he whispered. Captain Hendricks organized the remaining Marines to prepare for the arrival of the relief force. Ammunition was consolidated, defensive positions reinforced, and the wounded gathered in the center of their perimeter for evacuation. Throughout the night, Johnson continued to signal the aircraft that provided their protective umbrella, guiding their attacks against enemy positions with the sound of his harmonica. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, Johnson could hear the distant sounds of heavy fighting, the relief column engaging enemy forces as they fought their way toward the ridge. They're coming, Rodriguez said beside him, hope evident in his voice for the first time in 24 hours. Johnson nodded, too exhausted to speak. He raised the harmonica to his bloody lips once more, playing not the SOS signal this time, but a different pattern, one that would guide the relief force to their exact position. The sound of the harmonica echoed through the valleys below, carrying on the morning breeze. The fighting grew closer, the distinctive sound of American weapons becoming clearer by the minute. Finally, at the base of the ridge, Johnson spotted them. Marines in battle gear fighting their way upward. Their advance was coordinated with air support, Corsairs screaming in to suppress enemy positions whenever the ground forces encountered resistance. Captain Hendricks ordered flares fired to mark their position. Within an hour, the lead elements of the relief force reached their perimeter. Captain Hendricks, called a major as he approached their lines. Major Lawrence, 2nd Battalion. We're here to get you out. Hendricks stepped forward. Major, your timing is impeccable. Lawrence looked around at the battered Marines, his expression grim. Looks like you've been through hell, Captain. We have, Hendricks agreed. And we'd still be there if not for Private Johnson and his harmonica. Major Lawrence looked confused. Harmonica? Sir, Hendricks said with pride, placing a hand on Johnson's shoulder. Let me introduce you to Private First Class Marcus Johnson. He's the reason any of us are still alive. As the relief force secured the perimeter and began evacuating the wounded, Johnson sat on a rock, the blood-stained harmonica cradled in his hands. Around him, Marines who hours earlier had expected to die were now helping each other down the ridge toward safety. The night had been transformed from certain defeat into an improbable rescue. Lieutenant Davis approached, his usual skepticism replaced with grudging respect. Johnson, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I thought your idea was crazy. Johnson looked up, managing a small smile despite his split lips. It was crazy, Lieutenant, just crazy enough to work. 800 men, Davis said, shaking his head in disbelief. Your harmonica saved 800 men. The number struck Johnson. 800. He hadn't realized there were that many. Throughout the night, scattered units had found their way to their position, drawn by the sounds of air support and the knowledge that a defended perimeter existed on the ridge. As medics attended to the wounded and fresh troops took up defensive positions, Colonel Spencer himself arrived at the perimeter. He immediately sought out Captain Hendricks for a report, listening intently as Hendricks recounted their ordeal. "And you say this Private Johnson used a harmonica to signal aircraft?" Spencer asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "Yes, sir," Hendricks confirmed. "Without his initiative, we would have been overrun before nightfall. He maintained the signal throughout the night, guiding air support with pinpoint accuracy, despite enemy fire and personal exhaustion." Spencer turned to Johnson, who struggled to stand at attention despite his fatigue. "At ease, Private," the colonel said. "Captain Hendricks tells me you're responsible for saving his company." "Just did what needed doing, sir," Johnson replied hoarsely. Spencer studied him for a long moment. "We had no idea you were in such dire circumstances until those Corsair pilots reported hearing an SOS on what sounded like a harmonica. Most of the command staff thought they were crazy. Fortunately, someone believed them, sir." "The squadron commander insisted they investigate," Spencer explained. "When they confirmed American troops were surrounded, they launched everything we had. The pilots reported following a musical signal to identify friend from foe in the darkness, most precise night support I've ever witnessed." As the sun rose higher, the full extent of their ordeal became clear. The ridge was littered with evidence of the desperate defense: empty cartridge cases, discarded equipment, hastily dug fighting positions. But the Marines had held against overwhelming odds. "Private Johnson," Colonel Spencer said formally, "consider yourself recommended for the Silver Star. What you did here was beyond the call of duty." Johnson was too exhausted to fully process the colonel's words. All he knew was that they had survived, against all odds. And his father had been right. Music did indeed have power, more than he had ever imagined. As the last of the wounded were evacuated, and the Marines prepared to withdraw from the ridge, Johnson took one final look at the position they had defended so desperately. In the morning light, he could see the valleys below where hundreds of enemy troops had massed for an assault that would have certainly overwhelmed them without the air support. Johnson carefully placed his harmonica back in his breast pocket, the metal case now dented and stained with his own blood. What had begun as a simple reconnaissance mission had transformed into something none of them could have anticipated. A testament to human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds, and a reminder that sometimes the simplest tools could make the difference between life and death. As he turned to join the column moving down the ridge, Captain Hendricks fell into step beside him. "You know, Johnson," the captain said quietly, "when this war is over and people ask what it was like, I'm going to tell them about the night a harmonica saved 800 Marines." Johnson nodded, too tired for words. The sun was fully above the horizon now, casting long shadows across the ridge. Behind them, Corsairs continued to patrol overhead, their engines a reassuring rumble in the morning sky. Ahead lay the American lines and relative safety. But the melody of survival that had played throughout the night would continue to echo across the island, a testament to one Marine's ingenuity and courage in the face of impossible odds. July 15th, 1944. Naval Hospital, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the recovery ward, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floor. Private First Class Marcus Johnson sat on the edge of his hospital bed, carefully polishing the dented harmonica that had saved 800 lives on Saipan. 25 days had passed since that desperate night on the ridge, yet the memories remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The harmonica, once bright and shiny, now bore the scars of battle, a fitting metaphor for Johnson himself. What began as an act of desperate improvisation had evolved into a tactical innovation studied by military strategists, revealing how human ingenuity could bridge technological failures when conventional wisdom faltered. "Looking sharp today, Johnson," called a familiar voice. Johnson looked up to see Captain Hendricks entering the ward, his uniform crisp despite the Hawaiian humidity. Unlike many officers who might have taken sole credit for their unit's survival, Hendricks had been insistent that Johnson's role be properly recognized. "Captain," Johnson said, starting to rise. "At ease," Hendricks said, waving him back down. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, sir," Johnson replied. His lips had healed, though the doctors had warned him that some scarring might remain, a permanent reminder of the night he had played until he bled. Hendricks pulled up a chair beside the bed. "The rest of the company has already shipped back out. They're headed for Tinian." Johnson nodded. The campaign to secure the Marianas was continuing without him. While his physical wounds were healing well, the doctors had insisted he remain at Pearl Harbor for additional recovery time. "I know you're eager to rejoin them," Hendricks continued, "but there's something else in the works for you." "Sir?" Hendricks smiled. "Colonel Spencer has been telling your story." People at division headquarters were skeptical at first. A harmonica guiding precision airstrikes seemed far-fetched. But then the after-action reports started coming in from the pilots. Every single one mentioned the distinctive sound they followed. Johnson looked down at the harmonica in his hands. "Just did what needed doing, sir." "That's what I told them you'd say," Hendricks chuckled. "But here's the thing, Johnson. What you did that night has people thinking." The communication problems we experienced on Saipan weren't unique. Radio failures in volcanic terrain have hampered operations throughout the Pacific campaign. "I imagine they have, sir." Hendricks leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Division has authorized a special training program, alternative communication methods in combat environments. They want you involved." Johnson looked up in surprise. "Me, sir?" "You," Hendricks confirmed. "Your experience demonstrated that in the absence of functioning technology, unconventional methods can bridge the gap. The brass wants to formalize some of these approaches, develop protocols that can be taught to other units." Johnson was silent for a moment, absorbing the implications. As a Black Marine, he had grown accustomed to limited opportunities, despite his abilities. The Montford Point Marines, the segregated units where Black Marines trained, had fought valiantly throughout the Pacific, but recognition had been slow in coming. "When would this start, sir?" he asked finally. "As soon as you're cleared by medical," Hendricks replied. "You'd be temporarily assigned to division headquarters, working with communications officers to develop the training program." Johnson nodded slowly. "I'd be honored, sir." As Hendricks rose to leave, he hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "Almost forgot. This came through official channels yesterday." He handed Johnson an envelope bearing the seal of the United States Marine Corps. Johnson opened it carefully, his eyes widening as he read the contents. It was official notification of his Silver Star citation, signed by the division commander himself. "Congratulations, Johnson," Hendricks said, extending his hand. "Well deserved." After Hendricks departed, Johnson sat alone in the hospital ward, the medal citation in one hand and his harmonica in the other. He thought about the long journey that had brought him to this moment, from the segregated neighborhoods of Detroit to the ridge on Saipan where his music had meant the difference between life and death. 2 weeks later, having been cleared by medical staff, Johnson reported to division headquarters at Camp Catlin near Pearl Harbor. He was directed to a classroom building where several officers were gathered around a large table covered with maps and communication equipment. "Private First Class Johnson reporting as ordered, sir," he announced, standing at attention in the doorway. Major Lawrence, whom Johnson recognized from the relief force on Saipan, looked up from the table. "Johnson, come in. We've been waiting for you." As Johnson entered the room, he was surprised to see several senior officers present, including Colonel Spencer, and an imposing figure he didn't recognize, a brigadier general with pilot's wings on his chest. "Johnson," Colonel Spencer said, "allow me to introduce Brigadier General Robert Maxwell, commanding officer of the 4th Marine Air Wing. He's taken a particular interest in what happened on Saipan." Johnson came to attention and saluted. "Sir." "At ease, Johnson," the general said, returning the salute. "I've read the reports about your improvised signaling method. Remarkable initiative." "Thank you, sir." "What interests me," General Maxwell continued, "is how effectively it worked. My pilots reported unprecedented accuracy in their night strikes, guided solely by the sound of your harmonica. Major Lawrence gestured to the table where various pieces of communication equipment were displayed. We've been analyzing the communication failures experienced on Saipan. The SCR-300 radios performed well below expectations in that terrain. The volcanic composition of the islands creates natural interference, added a captain, whom Johnson didn't recognize. The man wore the insignia of a communications officer. Radio waves simply couldn't penetrate certain areas, particularly along the central ridge where your company was trapped. Colonel Spencer turned to Johnson. That's where you come in. We want you to walk us through exactly what you did that night, every detail, no matter how small. For the next hour, Johnson recounted the events on the ridge, how he had first thought to use the harmonica, the specific patterns he had played, and how the aircraft had responded. The officers listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification. The Morse code was key, General Maxwell noted. Our pilots are trained to recognize it in various forms: light, radio, even visual markers on the ground. But sound at that frequency, carrying through valleys, that was unexpected. The harmonics, said the communications officer suddenly. Johnson, what key was your harmonica tuned to? Johnson considered the question. C major, sir. The officer made a note. The fundamental frequency of a C major harmonica would be around 260 Hertz. Interesting. Why is that significant, Captain? Asked Colonel Spencer. Because, the communications officer explained, that frequency range travels remarkably well through certain atmospheric conditions. It's also distinct from most natural and mechanical sounds in a combat environment, making it easily distinguishable to the human ear, even amidst significant background noise. General Maxwell nodded thoughtfully, which explains why my pilots could isolate and follow the sound so effectively. Over the following days, Johnson worked closely with the communications team to formalize what had been an act of desperate inspiration into a structured protocol. They tested various musical instruments for their carrying capacity in different terrains, ultimately confirming that the harmonica's frequency range was indeed optimal for the purpose. The beauty of it, explained Captain Winters, the communications officer, is its simplicity. A harmonica requires no power source, has no components that can fail, and can be easily carried by any Marine. It's immune to electronic countermeasures and natural interference. Johnson demonstrated the specific patterns he had used, which were then standardized and documented. The officers were particularly interested in how he had used different rhythms and intensities to guide the aircraft to specific targets. You essentially created an auditory grid, General Maxwell observed after one demonstration. The pilots could triangulate their position relative to yours based on the sound alone. By the end of the second week, a preliminary training manual had been drafted titled Alternative Signaling Methods in Combat Environments. Johnson's harmonica technique featured prominently alongside other unconventional communication methods developed throughout the Pacific campaign. On a warm August afternoon, Colonel Spencer called Johnson into his office. Johnson, the training program is proceeding well. We're ready to begin implementing it across several units. Glad to hear it, sir, Johnson replied. Spencer studied him for a moment. You miss your unit, don't you? Johnson hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir. Charlie Company became like family. I understand, Spencer said. Unfortunately, they're still engaged on Tinian. But there's something else I want to discuss with you. He slid a folder across his desk. Johnson opened it to find transfer orders, not back to Charlie Company, but to a specialized communications unit attached to the 3rd Marine Division. Your experience is too valuable to risk in frontline combat right now, Spencer explained. This unit is developing and implementing advanced communication protocols for island operations. They need someone with practical experience in alternative methods. Johnson read through the orders. This says I'd be promoted to corporal, sir. Indeed it does, Spencer confirmed with a slight smile. The promotion has already been approved. You've earned it, Johnson. 3 days later, Corporal Marcus Johnson was on a transport plane bound for Guam, where the specialized communications unit was based. As the aircraft droned over the vast Pacific, Johnson reflected on how dramatically his war experience had changed in just a few short months. The communications unit on Guam was unlike anything Johnson had encountered before. Housed in a series of concrete bunkers, it was filled with cutting-edge radio equipment, radar systems and other technologies that seemed straight out of a science fiction novel. Lieutenant Commander Richard Bennett, the officer in charge, was a Naval Academy graduate with expertise in electronic warfare. He greeted Johnson warmly upon his arrival. "Corporal Johnson," Bennett said, shaking his hand. "I've read all about your harmonica technique. Brilliant improvisation." "Thank you, sir," Johnson replied, somewhat uncomfortable with the praise. "Let me show you what we're working on here," Bennett continued, leading Johnson through the facility. "Our mission is to ensure that what happened to your company on Saipan never happens to another unit." The bunkers contained workshops where technicians were modifying standard radio sets, testing various antenna configurations, and experimenting with new transmission methods. "The problem with our current radio technology," Bennett explained, "is its vulnerability to both natural interference and enemy jamming. We're approaching the problem from multiple angles, improving the technology itself, developing countermeasures against jamming, and creating backup systems for when primary communications fail." Johnson was assigned to a team focused on the latter, alternative communication methods that could function when conventional technology failed. His harmonica technique was just one of several approaches being formalized into training protocols. Over the following weeks, Johnson worked closely with the team, helping to refine and test various methods. His practical experience on Saipan proved invaluable as they developed training scenarios and evaluated different approaches. September brought news of continuing Allied advances across the Pacific. Johnson's former unit, Charlie Company, had survived the Tinian campaign and was now undergoing rest and retraining on Guam. Captain Hendricks arranged a reunion with Johnson at the first opportunity. "Corporal now, is it?" Hendricks said with approval when they met at the officers' club, which had been opened to Johnson for the occasion. "The promotion suits you." "Still getting used to it, sir," Johnson admitted. Hendricks introduced him to several replacement officers who had joined the company after Saipan. "This is the Marine I told you about," he said proudly, "the one with the harmonica." As the evening progressed, Johnson learned that his story had spread throughout the division. Marines from other units approached to shake his hand, many expressing disbelief that something as simple as a harmonica had proven so effective. "Is it really true you guided Corsairs within 50 yards of friendly positions?" asked a young lieutenant. "In the dark, no less," added another officer. Johnson downplayed his role, emphasizing the skill of the pilots and the courage of Charlie Company in holding their position against overwhelming odds. But privately, he felt a quiet pride in what he had accomplished. Later that night, as he walked back to his quarters, Johnson reflected on how his war experience differed from what he had expected when he joined the Marines. Like many Black Americans, he had enlisted partly out of patriotism, and partly to prove that he deserved the same respect and opportunities as anyone else. The segregated training at Montford Point had been challenging, designed to break the spirits of men who had already endured a lifetime of discrimination. Yet here he was, a corporal in a specialized unit, his innovation being adopted across the Marine Corps. The irony wasn't lost on him. It had taken an act of desperate creativity in combat to overcome some of the barriers that had been placed before him. October brought a new development. Lieutenant Commander Bennett called Johnson into his office one morning, his expression unusually serious. "Corporal, how would you feel about returning to combat operations?" he asked without preamble. Johnson straightened in his chair. "Sir?" "Not as a front-line infantryman," Bennett clarified. "We're forming specialized communication teams to deploy with forward units in the coming operations. These teams would implement the protocols we've been developing here, including your harmonica technique." Johnson considered the proposal. While his work at the communications center had been important, he had sometimes felt removed from the real war effort. "I'd be honored to serve wherever I'm needed, sir," he replied. Bennett nodded, seeming pleased with the response. "I thought you might say that. We're assembling 4 teams, each attached to a different regiment. You'd lead one of these teams, training them in alternative communication methods and deploying with them in upcoming operations." "Lead, sir?" Johnson asked, surprised. "Yes, Corporal." Each team will consist of 4 Marines. You would be responsible for their training and performance in the field. Bennett studied him carefully. Do you think you're up to it? Johnson took a deep breath. Yes, sir. I believe I am. Over the next 2 weeks, Johnson selected and trained his team, 3 young Marines who showed aptitude for the specialized communication techniques. Each was issued a harmonica and trained in the specific patterns Johnson had developed, along with other alternative methods. Private First Class Rodriguez, whom Johnson had known from Charlie Company, volunteered for the team immediately. 2 others, Private Taylor and Private Williams, were communications specialists who had heard about Johnson's innovation and requested assignment to his unit. The key, Johnson explained during their training, is understanding that any form of communication is ultimately about patterns. Whether it's Morse code through a radio, signal flags on a ship, or notes on a harmonica, it's all just patterns that convey meaning. He had them practice in various environments: dense jungle, open beaches, rocky terrain similar to the ridge on Saipan. They tested the carrying distance of the harmonica under different weather conditions and times of day. At night, sound travels farther, Johnson instructed. The air is generally cooler and more still. That's why the harmonica worked so well on Saipan. The night air carried the sound for miles. By early November, Johnson's team was deemed ready for deployment. They were assigned to the 22nd Marine Regiment, which was preparing for operations against Japanese-held islands in the Western Pacific. Before deploying, Johnson received unexpected news. He was to be awarded the Silver Star in a formal ceremony at division headquarters. The recognition, while welcome, made him somewhat uncomfortable. Just did what needed doing, he repeated when congratulated by his teammates. The award ceremony was brief, but dignified. General Maxwell himself pinned the Silver Star on Johnson's chest while reading the citation detailing his actions on Saipan. Johnson stood at attention, thinking of the 800 Marines who had survived that night, many of whom had gone on to fight in subsequent campaigns. Following the ceremony, Johnson was surprised when General Maxwell requested a private word with him. "Corporal Johnson," the general said once they were alone, "I want you to know that what you did on Saipan has had far-reaching effects. Your technique has been incorporated into our air support protocols throughout the Pacific Theater." "Thank you, sir," Johnson replied, unsure what else to say. The harmonica method has already been used successfully in 3 other operations, Maxwell continued. In each case, it provided a crucial communication link when conventional methods failed. Johnson felt a surge of pride. "I'm glad it's helping save lives, sir." Maxwell nodded. "That's precisely why I wanted to speak with you. Your innovation demonstrated something we too often forget in the military. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective." The general reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box, which he handed to Johnson. Inside was a brand new Hona Marine Band harmonica, identical to the one Johnson had carried since boot camp, but unmarked by battle. "For when that one finally gives out," Maxwell said with a smile, gesturing to the dented harmonica visible in Johnson's pocket. "Though I imagine you'll keep it as a souvenir regardless." "Yes, sir," Johnson agreed. "I expect I will." 2 days later, Johnson and his team embarked on a transport ship bound for their forward operating base. As they sailed westward, Johnson spent hours on the deck, practicing with his harmonica and refining the techniques he would teach others. Rodriguez joined him one evening as the sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the ocean. "Never thought a musical instrument would become a weapon of war," he observed. Johnson considered this. "Not a weapon," he corrected. "A tool for survival. There's a difference." Rodriguez nodded. "Fair enough. Still, it's something to tell the grandkids someday, how a harmonica saved 800 Marines." Johnson smiled at the thought. Grandchildren seemed a distant prospect in the midst of a global conflict, but the image was appealing. Sitting on a porch somewhere in peacetime, perhaps in Detroit or some other city, telling wide-eyed children about the night when music had meant the difference between life and death. "If we make it through this," Rodriguez continued, "what will you do after the war?" Johnson hadn't given it much thought. "Go home, I suppose. Maybe study communications properly." This experience has shown me there's always more to learn about how people connect across distances. As their ship continued westward, Johnson found himself reflecting on the strange path his war service had taken, from a segregated training camp to a desperate ridgeline, from a hospital bed to a specialized communication unit, and now to deployment as a team leader. Each step had been unexpected, yet somehow fitting. The harmonica in his pocket, the original battle-scarred one, had become more than just a musical instrument or a memento. It represented the power of human ingenuity in crisis, the ability to find solutions with whatever tools were at hand. In a war dominated by ever more complex technology, it had been a simple instrument, played by a Marine who refused to give up, that had made the crucial difference. On their final night before reaching the forward base, Johnson stood alone on the deck, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. He took out his harmonica and played softly, not the urgent SOS pattern from Saipan, but a gentle melody his father had taught him years ago. As the notes drifted across the water, Johnson thought about the hundreds of Marines who had been on that ridge, many of whom would never know his name or exactly how they had been saved. Yet they had returned to their units, continued the fight, perhaps written letters home about their narrow escape. The story had spread through the Marine Corps, evolving with each telling, becoming something like a legend. Johnson smiled at the thought. Legends were for heroes, and he didn't consider himself one of those. He was just a Marine who had done what was necessary with the tools available, like countless others throughout the war. The ship's horn sounded, signaling lights out. Johnson played a final note, then carefully returned the harmonica to his pocket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply the lessons of Saipan. The war was far from over, and there would be more ridgelines, more moments when communication meant the difference between life and death. But tonight, under a canopy of stars far from home, Corporal Marcus Johnson allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. His music had saved lives, and would save more before this conflict ended. In a war where so much was destroyed, there was profound meaning in that creation, turning simple notes into a lifeline for those who needed it most. Years later, long after the war had ended, Marcus Johnson would indeed sit on a porch in Detroit, telling his grandchildren about his experiences. He would show them the dented harmonica, carefully preserved in a small display case alongside his silver star and other medals. He would explain how, in the most desperate circumstances, he had found a way to communicate when all conventional methods had failed. Music speaks when words cannot, he would tell them. Remember that. Sometimes the oldest, simplest technologies are the most reliable. His story would eventually be documented in Marine Corps training materials, taught to new generations of communication specialists as an example of improvisation in combat. The Johnson harmonica method would become part of military communications law, referenced in textbooks and historical accounts of the Pacific Campaign. But for Johnson himself, the most meaningful legacy came during a Marine Corps reunion in 1967, when a man approached him extending his hand. "You won't remember me," the man said. "I was on that ridge on Saipan, one of the 800. Never knew until years later that it was a harmonica guiding those planes." Johnson shook his hand, emotion welling up unexpectedly. "Glad you made it through," he said simply. "My children exist because of what you did that night," the man continued. 3 kids, 5 grandchildren now. None of them would be here if those planes hadn't found us." Johnson nodded, unable to find words adequate for the moment. It was the most profound reward possible. Knowing that his desperate improvisation had created not just survival, but life itself, generations continuing because of notes played on a simple harmonica during one desperate night on a distant island. Through the decades that followed, as America changed and the barriers that had once restricted his opportunities gradually fell, Johnson would often reflect on how his wartime experience had shaped him. The lesson of the harmonica stayed with him, that innovation often emerges from necessity, that communication bridges divides of all kinds, and that sometimes the simplest solutions prove the most powerful. The dented harmonica remained his most treasured possession, more meaningful than the medals and citations that had followed. It represented not just the lives saved on that distant ridge, but a philosophy that had guided him through the challenges of post-war life, finding ways to connect, to communicate, to build bridges rather than walls. And on quiet evenings, when memories of the war surfaced unbidden, he would sometimes take out the new harmonica General Maxwell had given him, the old one too precious to play regularly, and send notes drifting through the night air. Different melodies now, peaceful ones, yet carrying within them echoes of that desperate signal that had guided pilots through darkness to save 800 lives on a forgotten ridge in the Pacific. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.